Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Jackson, and the focus is kill the bank and the economy. Andrew Jackson had two major economic planks in his presidential agenda. One was to reduce the debt, the other was to shut down the Bank of the United States. The first one we can actually take care of relatively easily. It was accomplished on January 1st, 1835, when the debt of the United States was actually eliminated, a rare moment in American history as debt-free. He did it through spending cuts, his own policy initiatives. It was a lot of work, sort of behind the scenes, year over year, but by 1835, for a brief moment in time, the Americans had no debt. That accomplishment aside, his other objective was much noisier, much more difficult, but ultimately successful in shutting down the Bank of the United States. The bank had existed in its first form since the presidency of George Washington, and it had been a battle from the beginning between the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians on both constitutional and policy grounds. Jefferson and his followers believed the bank to be unconstitutional. There was nothing in the Constitution that said Congress could charter any institution, let alone a bank. But policy decisions also drove them. They believed that this was a centralization of power, where the federal government was taking power away from the individual states. This was bad policy. Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, on the other hand, thought perfectly constitutional. He's got the necessary and proper clause that made it so. And by the way, it's good policy. It's better for the credit of the United States. It's better for the economic well-being of the country as a whole. George Washington sided with him, as did Congress, and the bank was established. It survived until 1811, when its charter was not renewed, but it came back in a second iteration of the Bank of the United States in 1816 on a 20-year charter. So that recharter would be up potentially in Jackson's second term in 1836. The bank was housed in Philadelphia. It had a powerful boss in the presidency of the bank of Nicholas Biddle, who was very much obviously going to fight for his bank, and Andrew Jackson was strongly opposed on those same grounds, both constitutionally, he thought it was unauthorized, but more importantly on policy. He felt it was undemocratic, that the bank was run by these elites, unelected people who were wealthy and beyond their means, and they were controlling the economy without the people's representatives having much say. The American economy fed tax dollars into the United States government, and they placed those funds in the bank, but they only had a minority seat on the board. Nicholas Biddle could pretty much do whatever he wanted in terms of loans and investment and other policies. And Jackson felt this was undemocratic, unfair to the American people, and he was bound and determined to kill the bank. Well, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster were supporters of the bank, and they helped convince Nicholas Biddle to apply for recharter early, before the 1832 election, 4 years early, in fact. Why? Because they thought Jackson would definitely veto a bank bill after the 32 election if he were reelected, but before he might be a little wary, because Pennsylvania, the home of the bank, had the second most electoral votes in the Electoral College. Maybe he would pause and not veto if it happened before the election. So Biddle went forward, and of course they were all wrong. This was Andrew Jackson, and Jackson said, "I will prove to them that I will never flinch, that they are mistaken when they expected to act upon me by such considerations, by rechartering early." And sure enough, Jackson went ahead and vetoed the bill just prior to the 1832 election. He had a couple of reasons, and some of them, again, were quite bold. The bank had actually been deemed constitutional in a Supreme Court decision, McCulloch v. Maryland. Jackson felt unbound by this decision. He said in his veto message that mere precedent is a dangerous source of authority and should not be regarded as deciding questions of constitutional power, except where the acquiescence of the people and the states can be considered as well settled. This was again Jackson asserting his authority not just as another co-equal branch of government, but as independent of the decisions of the other branches. He didn't care what the Supreme Court had to say about the bank. He thought it was unconstitutional, and that was part of his justification to veto. But policy differences, of course, also drove this, as did most of his vetoes. And he said, when the laws undertake to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favor favors to themselves have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. There are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. Jackson was the representative of the people, the masses as a whole. He came from humble background. He was going to look out for the people, defend them. This was an undemocratic institution. It had to go, and so he vetoed. The election came up in 1832, and the people supported Jackson. In fact, in droves, he won easily re-election, and this buoyed his sense that he was on the right path on all of his policies, including the one about the Bank of the United States. The fact that he was able to veto the bank recharter early didn't kill the bank, because it had 4 years left to go. The veto may have been the death sentence, but he wanted to accelerate the execution. He didn't want to wait till 1836 for the bank to go away, and so he came up with an idea. He'll just take all the money out. All the funds, the government funds that were a significant portion of the funds in Biddle's bank, not all because it was a commercial bank as well, he just said, I'm just going to kill that institution by taking the money and putting it somewhere else. And politicians were aghast, bankers were aghast. They thought this was going to absolutely wreck the economy. Congress, his cabinet, even his kitchen cabinet, were strongly opposed to Jackson simply taking money out of the Bank of the United States and leaving it somewhere else to execute, but putting the economy essentially at risk by doing so. Nicholas Biddle thought that Jackson was all out of his mind in thinking such a thing. He said, they will not dare to remove them, the government funds. If the deposits are withdrawn, it will be a declaration of war which cannot be recalled. Later, Biddle said, this worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken. Well, of course, Biddle was mistaken, as you just had to learn with Andrew Jackson. You try to go up against him, he is going to come at you and come at you until he is victorious. And that is, in essence, what happened here with the bank. Jackson had only one snag before he could take those funds out of the bank, and that had to do with the law. The law said only the Secretary of the Treasury could withdraw government funds from the Bank of the United States. And Lewis McClane, the Treasury Secretary, refused. He thought this was a terrible policy and was going to wreck the economy. So what did Jackson do? He made Lewis McClane his Secretary of State, which had just opened up, got him out of the Treasury Department, and brought in a gentleman by the name of William Duane. Well, Duane took the job because he thought he could convince Jackson to change his mode and not withdraw the funds. Well, clearly he didn't know Jackson very well, so Jackson almost immediately asked for his resignation. Duane refused, so he fired him. There was one person left in the cabinet who was fully on board with Jackson's approach. Only one, and that was Roger Taney, who was the Attorney General. So, not surprisingly, within a few days, he was now the Treasury Secretary through a recess appointment, and Taney was more than happy to prepare to take the funds out of the bank. Jackson, by the way, would later reward Taney with a seat on the Supreme Court, where he sat as Chief Justice for over 30 years. Now, Nicholas Biddle wasn't about to simply sit by while all this was going on, and Jackson knew it, so he knew he had to take those funds out of the bank and do it quickly, but he had to figure out what was he going to do with them. Well, his administration found a number of state banks. They were called pet banks, his pet choices, where they would take the funds and it would just be managed through another institution, but not as a single national bank. And so Jackson, knowing that Biddle could pounce, took those funds out of the bank in less than a week. He found 7 state banks initially to house those funds. Ultimately, by the end of the year, that was over 20, and others would be signing on. And Biddle did act. As soon as those funds were out, he basically helped the economy go into the tank. He called in loans. He wouldn't lend out any money. He had more specie, more hard currency than anyone in the country, and he was holding it tight. And he wasn't going to give in to Jackson, but Jackson certainly wasn't going to give in to him. The money was already out, but people were complaining because the economy is going into the tank. Credit had essentially seized up, and the economic engine of the country was basically stalled. But Jackson didn't want to hear complaints. He said, look, Biddle's got all the money. Go see him. I did what was right on behalf of the American people. What about Congress? Well, Congress didn't appreciate what Jackson did from a majority standpoint, but not a supermajority. They didn't have enough votes to override Jackson's veto, but they were complaining about his sort of monarchical tendencies and his decision, his unilateral decision to just take those the funds out of the Bank of the United States. And so Henry Clay, now in the Senate, said, you know what, I can't override this veto, but I can do something else. We're going to censure the President of the United States for going beyond his authority and taking these funds out of the bank. And sure enough, the Senate passed that censure. Jackson said, you can't censure me. There's nothing in the Constitution that says Congress can censure the President. If you want to come after me, impeachment is all you've got. And by the way, that has to start in the House of Representatives. So he largely ignored the censure publicly, although it really gnawed at him personally that it was still out there on the books. Interestingly enough, the politicians started to slowly gravitate to Jackson's point of view. The governor of Pennsylvania, of all people, came down against Biddle. The congressional delegation from Pennsylvania also came down against Biddle. And eventually, in April 1834, the House Ways and Means Committee issued a resolution that it believed the bank funds should never be returned to the Bank of the United States. At this moment, Jackson felt his victory was complete. Even the politicians were now on his side that he had done the right thing. But he still wasn't done yet. King Andrew I, as many had been calling him during this monarchical phase of his presidency, wanted to go even further because it wasn't just the bank and the national bank that caused him anxiety. It was also paper money, soft currency that he believed led to speculation that helped the speculators, the wealthy, but were bad for the poor and the common man. So he believed only specie, hard currency, gold, or maybe silver should be used in transactions with the federal government. And unilaterally, by himself, in true despotic fashion, he passed what it was called his Specie Circular in July of 1836, his last year in office, which said only specie, hard currency, could be used in transactions with the federal government over the sale of public lands, which was a big deal across the country. This was even more devastating to the economy than when he took the money out of the Bank of the United States, because there wasn't enough specie in the entire country to satisfy this demand. There were runs on the banks, people to take the hard currency out. It then got stored up in individuals' holdings, and it wasn't being part of the fluid use of the economy. The economy went sour, and Jackson once again didn't want to hear it. He thought this was a good policy. It was going to help the country in the long term. It actually sent the country into a recession. His successor, Martin Van Buren, was really the one who suffered for it, and his administration to follow. But Jackson was convinced all of these maneuvers on the economy were good for the American people, and he was happy to do it. In the end, he triumphed. His goals were fulfilled. He killed the undemocratic bank. He restored the control of the country's money to the elected representatives, not the unelected elites. Sure, the economy tanked in the process. The Specie Circular made it even worse, but that was all in a day's work for King Andrew I. That is Andrew Jackson. Kill the bank and the economy. From the life of Andrew Jackson. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.